lecture. I'm very honored to be invited and included in this speaker series. Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about what nanotechnology is, what nanomaterials are, and what is my research group doing towards contributing to this very big field. So we're trying to design these very tiny materials to address some very grand challenges, which hopefully I'll get to tell you today. But before I get to the research part of this presentation, I just want to take a second and acknowledge my team. While I have the fun job of being here in the face of the research that I'm showing you today, it's actually these folks that do all the hard work and in the lab come up with the solutions. So all the research work I'll be showing you today is actually done by my fantastic research team. I've been very lucky in the last 5 years to work with talented individuals of students, postdocs, and research assistants. I would also like to give a shout out to my research collaborators. A lot of the problems that we are trying to address are very complex and it requires an interdisciplinary team and a lot of different types of expertise. So I would like to thank collaborators locally, nationally, and internationally. And lastly, I would like to thank these funding agencies for funding the work that I'm showing you today. So let's get into what is nanotechnology. Now, I was introduced to the field of nanotechnology almost about 15 years ago now. So I haven't actually gone and looked up online what is that, Google today tells you what nanotechnology is. So when I did the search for this talk, I was very surprised to see a lot of the images that came up had to do sort of these nano robots. So there was plenty of news articles surrounding these. So you see images with these machines coming in, chopping up our DNA material, trying to fix things, nanobots being injected into us. They're trying to interact with blood cells, molecules, proteins, DNA, all kinds of things. And reading through a lot of these research articles, nanotechnology is always sort of sold as this very emerging, cutting edge technology that, we can design these things that can go into our body, read our mind, fix every problem that's within us. So today, hopefully, I'll tell you, be able to show you that, in fact, a lot of the nanomaterials or the field of nanotechnology works around designing things more than just nanobots. In fact, a lot of it that we make and design are much more simple than these nanobots, and they're used beyond, and outside of our human body to do more than just going and reading our minds. So what exactly are nanomaterials? So nanotechnology is the field of studying, making, understanding, and applying nanomaterials. So the official definition of nanomaterial is that these are any type of material that have at least one dimension that's in between 1 and 100 nanometers. So here on the slide, we see all different materials at different scales. So if you start with a tennis ball, that's about 10 to the power of 8 nanometers. So it's pretty big. So as we start getting to smaller size, we have a salt grain here that's usually in millimeter size. And then we get to micron scale. So these are cells, bacteria, typically tend to be the micron scale. And as we get even smaller, we have virus. And then between this is where we have a lot of the nanomaterials. And nanomaterials can be naturally occurring, like biomaterials shown here, like a protein molecules, DNA, or virus, or they can be synthetic, so something that we prepare. And these can range anywhere from micelles to nanoparticles, polymers, quantum dots. These materials on the top here tend to be sort of 0-dimensional, so all the dimensions are less than 100 nanometers. We can also have one-dimensional materials like nanotubes, where the diameter of that is on nanoscale, but the length can actually be quite long, even on micron scale. Then we have 2-dimensional materials like graphene. So this is a sheet of carbon atoms. The thickness of this is on the nanoscale, whereas the actual sheet itself can again be on the micron scale. So we just need one of the dimensions to be between 1 and 100 nanometers for something to be classified as a nanomaterial. So why nano? Why do we care about nanomaterials? Now, there are kind of two big driving forces as to why people are interested in these. One is miniaturization. So we are requiring things to be smaller and smarter every day. So as our electronic devices and things get smaller and smaller, the chips that go into these electronic devices also have to get smaller, and they have now gotten to nanoscale. So a lot of the integrated chips that go into electronic components are on the nanoscale. So miniaturization is one of the driving force, but it's not the most dominant driving force. The main reason why we're interested in nanomaterials is because of these nano properties. So nano properties are these material behavior that only emerge when something is on the nanoscale. So if we have molecules, those properties don't exist. And if we have bulk material, those do not exist either. So it's a very narrow scale range in which these interesting mechanical properties, magnetic properties, optical properties that emerge. So we can now use these materials for applications that otherwise we couldn't think of or imagine before. So I'll talk about a couple of these nano properties today. I won't have time to touch all of these, but depending on which of these features we're trying to control and apply and study, it opens up all kinds of fields. So mechanical properties. So these are very high strength material that allow us to make very, very thin but very, very strong fibers, components. Magnetic properties allow us to apply these in quantum computing. Today, we'll discuss a little bit about the optical properties and some of the physical properties of nanomaterials. So when something is on the nanoscale, we tend to have very high surface area. So now let's look at this cube here. And the dimensions of this cube is 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. And if we calculated how much surface is on this cube, that's going to be 6 centimeters squared. Now, without changing the mass of the material, if we just cut it into smaller pieces, so now instead of having 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, we cut it into 1 millimeter cubes, then we increase the amount of the surface area. So now we increased it from 6 to 10 times that, so 60. Now let's take this from millimeter scale to nanometer scale. So now instead of having 1 millimeter, we have 1 nanometer cubes. So we have not changed the mass. So we still start with this mass we had before, but now by cutting into smaller pieces, we now increase the surface area to a very, very large number, almost close to a football field. And we just started with this very tiny cube. So nanomaterials allow us to access high surface area, and this is very, very useful. Now, we have all seen this little silica gel packets that are everywhere. And if you open it up, you'll see they have this nice ball of white color or almost translucent looking material, and that's silica. But if you look under electron microscope, what we will see is that that's actually a nanoscale silica material. So it's a silica gel where we have these nanoparticulates that are interconnected with each other. And because of this porosity and the nanoscale of the silica inside it, it has very, very high surface area. And the reason we need high surface area is because these are used as desiccants. So these can absorb water. So by having very tiny amount of it, we can actually absorb quite a bit of moisture that's present. So they help improve the longevity of our clothes, bags, all kinds of materials. In fact, we even add silica gel to food. and it can prevent food from going bad because of moisture. So here I have a spice that I bought from home. So you can go look at, in your own spice rack, and one of the ingredients in here is calcium silicate. And you might have a spice at your home that also has silica or some sort of silicate salt, and that's exactly what it's doing. So it helps absorb moisture and it prevents clumping of food. And that same surface area is also used for catalysis. So we all have some sort of vehicles, and most of these vehicles have a catalytic converter in it. So what's inside this catalytic converter? So this is what it looks like. So instead of silicon dioxide, we have aluminum oxide in a catalytic converter. So aluminum oxide, similar to silica, is a very porous, high surface support material. And on this support, we have nanoparticles of metals like palladium, platinum, and rhodium. So these are precious metal, very expensive. So by using nanoparticles of this, we actually need a little bit of this material and we get a lot of surface area. And these are used in our catalytic converter to convert NOx and oxide gases into something that's less toxic, like nitrogen gas and carbon dioxide. So because these are very precious metals, by making them small, we can improve their activity, and we also just need a little bit of that. And this is the idea we explore in our research group as well. Nanomaterials are also good emitters, and this is known as quantum confinement effect. And this is what my PhD work focused on. So again, by making things tiny size, we can get them to emit light, and that's shown here. And this is again applied in light emitting diodes. And if you walked into Best Buy in the last few years, you've probably come across a panel of televisions that are QLED TVs. And the Q here actually stands for quantum dots. So that means these have quantum dots as the emitters for the colors that we see in this TV. Previously, we used to have OLEDs. So O here stood for organic light emitting diodes. And comparatively, quantum dots actually have narrower emission. So that helps with more contrast. So the colors look more crisp in QLED TVs. They're also good absorbers and scatterers, and there's so many different applications of nanomaterials currently where they are used to absorb light. And one such example is sunscreen. So summer will be here soon, hopefully, and you'll be applying sunscreens, and some of those sunscreens actually contain titanium dioxide or zinc oxide nanoparticles. And here is the absorbance spectra. So what it's showing is these nanoparticles absorb mostly the UV component of the solar spectrum. So beyond the UV, so getting into visible, they actually don't absorb that light, and most of it is reflected back. And this absorption is also size dependent. So here we see nanoparticles of different sizes as they're applied to skin. So when these particles are larger, they can absorb into that visible and kind of scatter a bit more light, so they appear white. And we don't like that white color when we apply sort of the sunscreen. We want that to go on clear. So if we actually make these nanoparticles smaller, so in the 15 to 10 nanometer size, they actually reflect that visible light very well and only absorb UV, and therefore they appear clear when we apply it on our skin. So by tuning the size, we can actually tune which light it absorbs and which light it reflects or scatters better. And it's not just for our skin. We can titanium dioxide nanoparticles are also used in deck stains, and it does the same thing. So it prevents the wood from being damaged from the UV light by absorbing that UV light as it does with our skin. So rather than our skin or the wood on the deck absorbing that UV light and undergoing damage, these nanoparticles absorb that light instead. The cosmetics industry is actually a big nanomaterial industry. So a lot of the shimmery material that we apply can be because of the nanoparticles reflecting certain types of light. And again, a lot of them also have UV absorbing nanoparticles as well, which prevent our skin from getting damaged. So these are some of the basic principles that we're also using in our lab to apply nanomaterials for a better, greener future. Now, I'm sure most of you here are aware of climate change and how dire the current situation is. Now, I know pandemic has sort of really taken our attention away a little bit, but that hasn't really stopped from a lot of the catastrophic events that have been happening in sort of the last decade. And we have seen, even during the pandemic, there was a lot of forest fires, unpredictable weather patterns, floods, extreme summers, extreme weather events we keep happening with the snowfall and everything. And that's only going to get worse as the climate change is going to get worse. The IPCC report was actually released last week, and it did say at the end of the report that the situation is actually quite dire and we need some very radical solutions if we are looking to slow down the negative impacts of climate change. The carbon dioxide concentration today is 418 ppm as of today, as in March 7th. And the warming of the planet is proportional to this carbon dioxide concentration. And this chart here shows that if we keep the pattern of our current carbon emissions, then that amount is going to keep increasing. And if we want to keep the values that we currently see, and this is not a good value, right? We're still seeing a lot of catastrophic events, but even if we want to keep it at the current numbers, we have to cut down our carbon dioxide emissions by at least 50% in the next couple of decades. So you can see we need some very radical changes in our lifestyle to be able to achieve this. So what are some of the big contributors to carbon dioxide? So here's the global greenhouse gas emission contributions from different sectors. And you can see things like electricity and industry and agriculture are pretty big contributors. And our research group is actually focusing on addressing these sectors here. So how do we sustainably produce chemicals? How do we sustainably produce heat and electricity, and some of the other things that I'll talk about today? And how does that help us reduce the amount of carbon dioxide? So let's start with the industry portion of that, the chemical production. And there are many different chemicals that we produce currently. And I'll just talk about one such chemical today, and that's hydrogen. Now, when we talk about hydrogen and we talk about electricity, we talk about green future, the one thing that always comes to our mind is fuel cells, because we can burn hydrogen cleanly in fuel cell to produce electricity, and there is no carbon dioxide emission associated with that combustion reaction. But if you actually look at the breakdown of where we currently use hydrogen, that's a very, very tiny part of the hydrogen consumption. Most of the hydrogen that we produce today is used for ammonia production. And ammonia is used as the fertilizer to grow food. So it's a very important chemical feedstock because that determines our ability to feed humanity. The rest is used in hydrogenation reactions, methanol production, and a very small proportion is used in producing green electricity. But let's look at that term green electricity a little bit closely, because where is the hydrogen currently coming from? 95% of our current hydrogen comes from steam methane reforming process. So this is where we take methane gas and react it with water at very high temperature and pressures, and that produces hydrogen, and it also produces a lot of carbon dioxide. In fact, we currently produce 600 million tons of carbon dioxide every year just by making hydrogen. So for every kilogram of hydrogen we make, we actually produce about 7 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So if hydrogen is to become one of the key fuel to make green electricity, then we really need a green way of making hydrogen gas. Otherwise, this doesn't really make much sense. So our group is working on coming up with technologies that allow us to produce hydrogen gas in a green way. And one way we can do that is by using water. So if we start with water and we put energy into that water, we can split it to make hydrogen and oxygen. And oxygen, we can release it, we can capture it, use it, and then we have this hydrogen. So there's not really carbon dioxide in this reaction. But where is that energy coming from? Because if that energy comes from fossil fuels, then again, we're back to emitting more carbon dioxide. But if we get that energy from a more sustainable source, from a renewable source, then we can actually make this process truly green. And if we look at all the different energy sources that is currently available to us, we'll see that solar energy is very abundant. In fact, it's much more than any energy source that is currently available to us. And that's in 1 year. So this is not the total amount, that's just for 1 year, that's how much we're getting. So if we couple solar energy with water splitting, then we have means of making green hydrogen. And that's really what my research group works on. So there's a few different ways how we can harvest the solar energy. One way we can do this is through PV electrolyzer. So in a PV electrolyzer system, we connect photovoltaic, so a solar cell, with an electrolyzer. So electrolyzer is where we do electrolysis, water electrolysis, and it produces hydrogen on one electrode and oxygen on the other electrode. So here is the lab demonstration of that process occurring. So here is 2 electrodes we have in water, and we see hydrogen being formed on this nickel electrode, and then oxygen is being formed on the carbon electrode. This is a high efficiency process. So compared to other methods, solar methods that are available to us, this is relatively high efficiency. However, it is also very high cost. And the reason it's high cost is because there's a lot of components that go into making a PV electrolyzer, but also the catalyst to make the hydrogen and the oxygen gas are based on precious metals. So we currently use platinum to make hydrogen and iridium to make oxygen. So our group is trying to replace this with more abundant materials, with abundant catalysts, so we can help bring down that cost. So we start with biochar. So this biochar we actually get from Dr. McQuarrie's group. Stephanie McQuarrie is currently in the audience at Cape Breton University. So her group actually makes this biochar, and we then take this biochar and mix it with molybdenum salt and magnesium. And then we get a catalyst known as molybdenum carbide, which almost looks like a sea urchin. And this particular catalyst is porous. It has very, very high surface area. It's on the nanoscale, and it actually performs as well as platinum when it comes to making hydrogen through water splitting. So this has been a very exciting result. And when we drive this process at very high currents, this actually outperforms platinum. So we have been looking at similar catalysts to replace iridium on the oxygen evolution electrode as well. We had some luck to replace that with refractory, but that's sort of the ongoing work. So here's one example of how we're trying to replace expensive metals. Now, there's still a lot of components that go into a PV electrolyzer. So we can further simplify that by using something known as a photocatalytic process. Now, photocatalytic process is actually quite similar to photosynthesis process. So leaves actually do this every day. So plants take sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water and convert that to sugars. And it gets that energy from solar light. So the idea was to then kind of mimic what nature is doing and take the solar energy, have a photocatalyst, so similar to what plants have, and split that to make hydrogen and oxygen. So this is a very simple setup. So we essentially have a tank with water and this catalyst suspended in it. And we expose it to natural sunlight for this to do that reaction. And again, previously people used to use titanium dioxide, a lot of sort of the catalyst that was not very efficient. So our group was trying to come up with the material that would be a little more efficient. And we came up with these porous silicon nanoparticles based photocatalysts. So again, because these are nanoscale and porous, they have very high surface area. So this high surface area means there's a lot of spots on this catalyst where the water can come in and get reduced to make that hydrogen gas. And silicon is also a very abundant element. So it's available everywhere on the planet. So it's very cheap and it's also non-toxic. So here is just the silicon photocatalyst suspended in water, and we have it out in the sunlight, and you can see that it's actually just splitting water and making hydrogen bubbles that you see evolving here. So you can see the system is much more simple, and because it's simple compared to the PV electrolyzer, this allows us to make hydrogen at a much lower cost than the PV electrolyzer system does. So we can now make hydrogen at least 1/4 the cost that PV electrolyzer systems do. So this is all great. So we have, the electrochemical process, we have the photocatalytic process. What happens if you need hydrogen on demand? What if we are in a remote location? We don't have a solar cell on us. There is no sun shining. There is no external power source to really power our electrolyzer. So what do we do then? How do we actually make hydrogen? So our lab has actually come up with a fuel material that actually allows us to produce hydrogen on demand. So I'm going to stop sharing just for a second here. So hopefully I can do a little demo. Woohoo! So here, I don't know how clearly you can see it, we have this nano powder, okay? So I can't tell you what the composition of this is because we're trying to commercialize this technology, but you can see I have it in an open flask. It's not catching on fire, it's stable. It's made of a cheap material, right? So we can save it, have it on us. And when we need the hydrogen produced, what we all simply need to do is add water to it. So here I have water in this beaker. So I'm going to add it to this fuel. Hopefully, I hope you can see some hydrogen bubbles being formed. So you can see the hydrogen gas just forms on demand as we need it. So it's a very simple, very straightforward way of producing hydrogen. So here is a video that shows the exact same hydrogen that I just showed you, but then the hydrogen that's made can actually be directly pumped into a fuel cell. So we don't need to purify it or anything. So you can see we're pumping it into the fuel cell, and this fuel cell is powering this LED here. So we can make this hydrogen on demand and use it as it's being produced. And because this is, again, a nanoscale material, it has that high surface area, that makes it very reactive.